You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host and bourbon-soaked storyteller, Juliette Miranda.
Hey there, y'all. It's Juliette Miranda, and welcome to episode 145 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. I have two bourbon-soaked stories for y'all today about my summer of Svengoolie and a Blinky bootleg shop. But first, you can't have bourbon-soaked stories without a little bit of bourbon. I'm filling my glass with Jim Beam Black. Cheers, y'all. So I am drinking Jim Beam Black today because it came as a suggestion from a listener named Jason. He had seen a commercial for it that boasted they had won some big bourbon award, and he wanted to know if it really was any good. I don't know if I can answer that. Apparently, this stuff is extra aged, and that means it's got about 8 years on it. And you could have fooled me. Ugh, the stuff is just so thin. Honestly, I have no idea how this swill won any awards. Oh, all right, I take it back. It's not swill, it's just really boring bourbon. I suppose this has a little bit more flavor than the standard Jim Beam. I mean, it does have a little bit more oakiness, and there is more cinnamon here, but it really vanishes quickly. I mean, you drink this, and it's kind of like just tasting flavored water. Now, it does have the advantage of being very, very inexpensive, but if you want a great, cheap bourbon, drink Very Old Barton. It's $12 a bottle, way more flavor, and you can even get a 100 proof version. It's good stuff. Go with that. Skip the Jim Beam Black. And believe me, y'all, I know, because I am coming off a 24-hour bender of bourbon, blood, and pork rinds. I'm exhausted and not entirely unlike veal at this point, but I gotta say, I am so happy about it. You see, I was participating in The Last Drive-In, a 24-hour horror movie marathon hosted by the amazing Joe Bob Briggs. He's a cult hero, a B-movie critic, and he is one of the best horror hosts on the planet. This wasn't so much a marathon as it was an all-out event, and it was streamed live on Shudder, which is kind of like the Netflix of horror movies. Now, I discovered Joe Bob in the mid-'80s when he hosted the drive-in theater on TMC. My dad and I used to stay up really late and watch him talk about some of the most grisly, disgusting movies ever made. And I kept watching him all the way through the 90s when he hosted Monster Vision on TNT. I just loved his sense of humor and that he could critique a movie based on a vomit meter and a severed limb count. Joe Bob was just smart and real, and so completely unlike all of the snotty movie critics that I'd read in the newspaper. But I do have to admit, he was not the first person to introduce me to the world of horror. That questionable honor goes to Rich Coase, who is also known as Svengoolie. At the time, he had a show on a local Chicago TV network. Now, where Joe Bob is this vivid Texan with bolo ties and a trailer, Sven is a ghoul with a top hat and a coffin. Which, when you're a kid in the early 80s, has got to be the coolest thing in the world. So every Sunday, I would scour the newspaper to see which movie he'd be showing the following Saturday. He had all of the classic horror movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon and The Mummy, and all week long, I would look forward to watching them. Because you have to remember back then, TV was more of an event. And it wasn't just about the movies. And sure, the movies were a blast, but tuning in for Svengoolie and later Joe Bob Briggs was about being with my friends and my family. We'd laugh at the over-the-top commentary, and I loved getting insight into the actors and the movie's history. And that really stuck with me. It did. So much so that when I got to college, I decided that I wanted to do for music what Sven and Bob had done for movies. Broadcast communications wasn't the most useful major I could have chosen, but I knew exactly where I wanted my first internship to be. WCIU, the local network that had just recently picked up the Svengoolie show. I didn't even know if they had an internship program. But I sent them a letter anyway, pitching myself as an expert writer and enthusiastic coffee getter. And then here's what I did a little differently. I signed off that letter by promising that if they did grant me an internship, I would handle every rubber chicken with care, and I would never, ever aim for Svengoolie's eyes. Now, I really think it was that last sentence that scored me the gig because you got to know, rubber chickens are as essential to the Svengoolie show as Sven himself. They're typically hurled in his direction when he makes a bad or overly corny joke. And that summer, I would become well-versed in the aerodynamics of a rubber chicken. Of course, for as confident as my letter may have sounded, in truth, I was terrified. To that point, the only TV studio I had ever been in was the one in my college, which, let's face it, wasn't exactly impressive. I mean, hell, we were still using a linear editing system. It was one step up from a razor blade and glue. So I had conjured up an image in my head of a professional TV studio. It was kind of part working girl and part Wayne's World. And I didn't want these people to think of me as just an intern. I wanted them to think of me as a colleague, as a professional. So for my very first day on the job, I put on my most respectable skirt, a blazer, and y'all, I carried a briefcase. Oh, God, it was horrible. This wasn't some cute girly replica that I could just sling over my shoulder. No. This was a clunky leather beast of a box that weighed at least 15 pounds without the extra resumes and sandwich and copy of Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media that I had stuffed in there. The only way I could have appeared more pretentious would have been to start dropping Latin phrases into conversation. So I'm sitting there in the lobby, and I'm waiting for my supervisor to come and get me. And I immediately realized then, thank God, that I look like an idiot. I mean, nobody there was wearing a suit. The people walking into the building were all wearing jeans and sneakers, and to my surprise, they really weren't that much older than me. I quickly stashed that stupid briefcase behind a row of plants. I untucked my blouse a little bit and pulled my hair out of the bun that I had wrangled it into. So I take a quick check of my reflection in the glass behind me, and I see that I now look like I have crawled out of the backseat of a car. Not exactly the impression I was going for, but I'll tell you, it did beat the low-rent Wolf of Wall Street that I was originally channeling. That was my first lesson in the reality of television. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. It's a lot like going backstage at a concert for the first time. Really, it's all sweat and cables. And back then, that studio was the very definition of scrappy. The programming consisted of a handful of original shows, like Svengoolie, as well as affiliate syndicated programming like Leave It to Beaver and The Three Stooges. The production staff was small and took on as many roles as union rules would allow, which meant that any one person could be a producer, a writer, a floor manager, and a set builder. And wow, were they happy to have my free labor. I mean, once I ditched the heels, of course. So I never fetched coffee. I never licked envelopes or had to contend with the usual menial tasks that are assigned to an intern. Instead, I got exactly what I wanted, to be welcomed onto the team like any other person. But of everything that I did, working with Rich Coase, Svengoolie, was hands down my favorite. To this day, I've never worked with anybody as genuinely nice or as funny as he was. I mean, he kept us in stitches the entire time. And that worked out well for me because I am occasionally a dingbat. The Svengoolie show was shot in a small multi-purpose studio. His set consisted of a dungeon wall and random props, and most of the time I'd hover around on the floor during takes. Ready to chuck chickens when the moment was right. But right around my third week, the assistant director asked me if I'd like to try my hand at being a floor manager on the next shoot. I couldn't believe they thought I was ready for that kind of responsibility. I mean, the floor manager is the person who essentially connects the production in the studio to the director in the control room. So I was thrilled. And I'm thinking, I'll manage the hell out of that floor. But then my goofy brain bulb dimmed because I realized that I had zero clue how to actually do it. Oh, sure, I knew how to do the countdown. I mean, any moron knows how to do that. The real question was, what the fuck happened after that? I could have asked the crew for help. I really could have. It wouldn't have been a big deal, but I am nothing if not resourceful, particularly when it comes to covering my own shortcomings. So the night before the shoot, I crammed, just like it was college. I pulled out all of my TV production textbooks, most of which were published in the 60s and 70s, and I memorized every floor manager hand command that I found. Speed up, slow down, 30 seconds, cut. Any command the director could have had, I knew how to mime it. Going into that shoot, I felt confident. Putting on the headset, I felt ready. But as Sven positioned himself for the opening shot, I panicked. Sven opens the show from inside his coffin. How in the world was I supposed to signal to him that we were rolling if he's buried inside a damn coffin? Do I knock? What do I do? Fortunately, the opening music was pumped into the studio, and Sven, who, unlike me, is a pro, knew enough how to find his own cue. So he launches into his opening bit. And this is exactly when I am besieged by a weird chorus of voices. Obviously, I hear Sven talking in the studio, but I can also hear his audio from the control room in my headphones. And on top of that is the director. And I can't figure out who he's talking to. It could be me, it could be the cameraman. Hell, he could have been ordering a pizza for all I knew. Now here's the reality of the situation. The show back then had a crew of maybe 3 people in the studio. Truth was, they did not need a floor manager. I mean, especially since the show wasn't live. All I was there to do was point. Do you think I could do that? Do you think I could just play in position and stay out of the way? Of course not. No, not me. No, I was too wrapped up in my own freaked out self-importance. So the next voice that I heard was my own little egotistical demon, who tells me that I could be floor manager extraordinaire, the toxic avenger of floor managers. And it's whispering things like, maybe you'll do such a good job they'll want you to direct next. So I take what I think is initiative, and I start getting fancy with my commands. Screw the director. I got this. I'm standing right next to the camera lens, locking eyes with Sven, and I'm doing this elaborate signal dance. At first, Sven just looks confused, but he keeps rolling with his intro. So I ramp up my hand signals, thinking, yeah, what this segment needs is a stretch. Stretch it out, Sven, stretch it. And he kind of tilts his head and stares at my wretched little mime routine, probably baffled as to why he would need to stretch his own scripted bit. By this time, I am waving my arms around so much, Sven finally breaks character and asks, is there a runway I don't know about? Are you trying to bring a plane in for a landing? And everyone just cracks up. And I have to realize that the real hand gesture I needed was a good slap to the head. Well, I begin laughing too, and I admit that I completely mangled the whole floor managing thing. They could have booted me out of the studio and put me on coffee duty, and I wouldn't have blamed them one bit. Instead, Sven and the AD patiently walked me through the role. And by the end of the shoot, I had figured out that it wasn't about me. It was about the team and working together to make a great show. If internships are meant to prepare you for what work is like outside of college, this one did the exact opposite. Because I'll tell you, I have not worked with a production team that was as encouraging, or just plain fun to be with since. Of course, I also haven't worked on a show quite like Svengoolie since then. Because the sad reality is, drive-in style shows are kind of a rare thing. Which is why I was so excited to see Joe Bob Briggs back on the air for his 24-hour drive-in marathon. To me, it was an event. It was just like when I was a kid. And for the entire week leading up to it, I planned a menu, I stocked up on bourbon. My guy and I even pulled an old digital projector out of the closet so that we could watch Joe Bob in true drive-in style. And I'll tell you, for those 24 hours, and I stayed up for all of them, all 24 hours, 13 movies, I was brought back to something I haven't really felt since that summer of Svengoolie. I mean, it was crazy. Thousands and thousands of people tuned in, all of us connecting online throughout the 24 hours to talk horror movies and comment along with Joe Bob, and all of us playing just a small part in making the event awesome. It was one of the very few times where I was actually excited to be a part of a group. Clearly, it's not something I do often or especially well. I guess horror just brings out the best in me. And for that, well, I have to give thanks to Joe Bob Briggs and Svengoolie. Cheers, y'all. If you want to see video of my experience watching the last drive-in horror marathon, and see how my guy and I created our own hillbilly home theater, just visit my YouTube channel. Search for Juliette Miranda, and you'll find my bourbon tasting videos and all of my wacky bourbon-soaked adventures. Now, here's what an alarming contradiction I am. Because I can go from saying how much I loved being part of that horror group to telling you now, holy crap, I wish some people would just stay dead. I suppose that sounds harsh, and it is. It's just that the damn internet keeps resurrecting these assholes that I buried in my mental graveyard years ago, and making it completely impossible for me to forget that they exist. Like this one chick. I'll call her Blinky. I don't really know how to describe our relationship. I suppose you could start by saying that we were coworkers. I generally believe that having a friendship with a coworker is just as dangerous as dating a coworker. And it is all because of Blinky that I feel this way. She and I met at a production company in Los Angeles. Blinky was an odd, unstable kind of chick with unusually beady eyes and a face like a bat. She had this habit of rapidly blinking her eyes when she was agitated or uncomfortable, and would occasionally lapse into these streams of Russian obscenities when she lost her patience with clients. She was the receptionist, and I was the office manager at this company, which, I mean, all things considered, really are the same damn job. I just got the added bonus of being the second line of defense for our boss, who would have been a decent guy if he wasn't regularly cheating on his wife. He had a stable of hookers and harpies who would regularly call the office, sometimes even going so far as sneaking in with the FedEx deliveries to try and get their claws on this guy. Blinky and I bonded over our shared annoyance of dealing with his leftovers. She and I would occasionally get lunch together, and by chance we wound up in the same yoga class, which made us friendly enough. And that's where the trouble started. Blinky began asking me for favors at work. At first, it wasn't a big deal. I covered for her when she was a few minutes late. I let her sneak a few letters into the postage machine. These were all things that I did for all of my coworkers, and all with my boss's blessing. I mean, he knew most of us were half broke, so as long as it wasn't abused, he was okay with letting people do things like run off a copy of their screenplay on the copier. But Blinky's requests started getting bigger. And as they did, they became less like favors and more like demands. She'd show up at my desk with 2 or sometimes 3 parking tickets that she wanted validated. And when I'd ask her who they were for, she'd go into that weird blinking stare for a minute before asking me why I needed to know. Because it's my ass if we run out of validation stickers before the end of the month? She'd take the tickets away without a word, but I could tell she was peeved. Which made me wonder, what the hell is she up to? So one day, I am filing a bunch of invoices when my boss starts screaming my name over the intercom. I run into his office thinking that there's a real problem, but he wants to know where the hell Blinky is. I just shrug. Not my zoo, not my monkey. But my boss is pissed. Apparently, the phones up front aren't being answered, and two of his floozies managed to get past the switchboard and ring through on his direct line. Congratulations, he says. She's now your responsibility. Find her. Great. Playing hide-and-seek with Blinky was not the career advancement that I had in mind. I had no idea where to start looking for her. The building was essentially a warehouse, with editing suites on one side, photo and video bays in the middle, and an assortment of offices and tech rooms on the other. I start in the bathroom, hoping that her absence was as simple as her passing out in a toilet. But no such luck. She's not on any of the video bays, and I can't believe she'd be in an edit suite, so I start poking my head in conference rooms and offices until I finally find her in the duplication room. The company did short-run duplication of movies and other projects, mostly mid-level porn and workout videos, but occasionally we'd get a new release blockbuster before it hit the theaters. And that is exactly what Blinky is back there duplicating. She doesn't look especially concerned to see me, but she does make a point of closing the door behind me. I ask, is that the new... Yep, it is. I want to pretend that I don't hear that. So instead, I tell her what our boss said and suggest that she gets back to her desk up front. She says she will, but then she asks me to stick around and keep watch on the rest of the duplications. And she says, I get good money for these. I'll split it with you. Blinky is so confident that I'm in, she doesn't even wait for my answer. She just breezes past me with a jaunty wave and heads back to her desk. Machines are just whirring behind me, coughing up way more DVDs than I am comfortable with. I look on the counter and I see that she didn't even have the courtesy to bring in her own blank discs to press. She had clearly broken into the company supply. God damn it, I don't want to deal with this. Look, when it comes to shady dealings and questionable business practices, I'm usually a you-do-you kind of gal. Hell, when we were discussing the concept of let the buyer beware in my college ethics class, I'm the same chick who was all for cracking open the odometer in a car and rolling back the miles. So my moral compass isn't exactly aligned. But fucking Blinky had dragged me into her little back alley setup completely unasked. Now, I'll be completely honest with y'all here. I saw which movie she was duplicating, and I had a pretty damn good idea just how much money could be made off of it. So yes, I was absolutely tempted. I was. But if I'm going to get canned from a job, it is not going to be because I am pirating DVDs. I have more class than that. Besides, I resented Blinky's assumption that I would just immediately have her back. My loyalty wasn't to her. My loyalty was to my paycheck, which never once blinked or bounced. So I gathered up her illicit production and brought it all to my boss, and I explained the situation. Blinky was fired exactly 10 minutes later. And as she was being escorted out, she stops in front of my desk. She blinks at me in rapid succession, calls me a bitch, and then says, I will get you back for this. I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking, sure you will. Sure you will, sweetheart. I was confident I would never see Blinky again. Sure, I had to change yoga studios as a precaution, but that wasn't a big deal. Really, Blinky knew nothing about me. Not where I lived, not my phone number. I wasn't even sure if she knew my last name. Oh, y'all. Crazy finds a way. It always does. Sometimes it's just a little slow about it. Like decades slow. A while back, I got an email from my friend Texas. She is a big fan of eBay, and she will spend hours of her life searching for nonsense like discontinued shades of her favorite lipstick. I've never understood this, I haven't, because seriously, there's a lot of lipstick in the world. Move on. But her obsessive hunting actually turned up something useful this time. She found someone selling unauthorized copies of my book. Now, I often joke about disreputable sellers on Amazon and eBay, and these people will legitimately buy something, whether it's my book or something else, and then they will mark the price up sky high with the smarmy hope that they'll create demand and trap some poor sucker into buying it. Now, for me, considering the number of times I've found my book languishing in bargain bins, I can't say this concerns me too much. But looking at this listing, something just looked off about the books that the seller was offering. Now, they weren't marked up too much, but still, the cover art was wonky, the size looked just slightly too small. And as for the seller, well, let's just say she also had what appeared to be a lot of DVDs with homemade cover art. Well, Texas and I set up a little impromptu sting. She ordered my book, and as I suspected, what arrived was definitely not from my publisher. And the name on the return address label? Fucking Blinky. That pilfering little wench stole my goddamn book. Oh, y'all. Her return address was in Nevada, and I'll tell you, I was a heartbeat away from getting on a plane and burning her fucking house down. Texas even offered to supply the matches. But no. As much as I would enjoy a good old-fashioned house burning, I'm a grown-up. And I doubt I would fare well in prison. So I did the adult thing. My publisher and I both filed violation reports with eBay, and Little Blinky's bootleg shop was shuttered. Still, I have to wonder. This chick nurtured that grudge for almost 20 years. God only knows what else she's done in that time, or what she'll do in the future. Because that kind of crazy never dies. So y'all, if you happen to see bootleg copies of this podcast or anything else with my name on it, all I can say is buyer beware. Cheers, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Unwritable Rant Podcast. Be sure to go to theunwritablerant.com if you want to check out back episodes or find out how to connect with me on Twitter. Or, if you're so inclined, there's a merch store where there are t-shirts and flasks and all sorts of other good stuff from other great podcasters, too. And now, y'all, I'm going to go drink some more bourbon and find some more trouble. Hope y'all have a great week. I'll be back next Sunday to chat with you some more. Cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablerant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, a couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton, hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.